We're black rebels, searching for freedom, trying to break these chains from my mind, trying to find the king that lies inside.
Away from the coffee. But the point that I wanted to make is that when you're talking about all of the equality stuff, you have these conversations online, you'll hear someone literally say, well, what are you talking about? Everyone has the same opportunity. We all have the same chance and you didn't take yours, blah, 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 which is, we know that's wrong.
That's what we tell ourselves so we can feel okay about taking advantage of the opportunities that we actually do have access to.
So what specifically, what did you see that those kids didn't have access to that we did?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Oh boy. It's...
what kinds of things did you notice? It was just like day and night, you know?
Well, I think one of the things, I would have all these conversations with my friends when we were just deciding where to send our kids to school, right? And I knew that I wanted to send my daughter to a local school that had socioeconomic diversity, racial diversity. I didn't want her to be in a segregated environment of any kind. And then when I was looking at a school like the one that I ultimately sent her to, which was Highlands Elementary, some of the feedback I would get from other parents as they were looking was, that school seems more focused on discipline than enrichment or academic achievement. And that kind of, that didn't really compute for me. I thought, well,
why is discipline a focus?
It's a school. You need to have a positive climate where it's peaceful and calm, and then everybody's learning in those classrooms. But there's a truth to that you see when you have the kind of system that I re-entered with my daughter, which is really a hyper resegregated system. And it's not that racial segregation has to equal this, but this is what we're currently seeing, is that you have schools that are predominantly low-income black and brown schools, students who are coming from situations with a lot of trauma, a lot of need, and maybe haven't had some of the exposures that students who don't come from those profiles have had in terms of academic preparation, but they've had other life exposures, not all of which are, bad in the sense that they're very resilient kids who have seen and learned a lot. But what you do see, I think, in the context of the traditional school system is an orientation towards, when you gather a lot of those children into one space, there's a concern about climate sort of keeping students in line, in a sense. In part because they come with very real traumatic expressions of behavior that do need to be addressed. Now, the way that we address them probably comes more from a disciplinary focus. It's like, stay in your seat, be quiet, just listen, this and that and the other thing. And when you have a student, when you have a child who's coming in with whatever kind of baggage, that takes a lot of resources to help that child get to that point of where they can be ready to learn and receive that traditional model of education. And so when you have a school where all or most of the students fit that profile, a lot of the resources get poured into addressing that. And we hope, thank you, in whatever is available to that school building or what they choose. And that does mean, in the current way that we provide resources to our schools, it's kind of a zero-sum situation. So if you're spending all your resources on behavioral supports, whatever that means for you, that probably means you're not spending those resources on enrichment, on gifted and talented programs, on accelerated learning opportunities and things like that. So that's just sort of like a literal expenditure of where the funds are going. And then in terms of the energy and the time that the people in the building to do the work have, they are spending time as well to honestly make up for a shortfall in the resources to address all the behavioral needs. They're spending time and energy on supplementing that rather than maybe being able to lean as much into, the enrichment and academic support. So what you end up seeing is just these differences in what's even delivered in terms of programming, or, everyone in a school district has the same curriculum, the same things that are supposed to be taught, but in terms of what you can actually get to based on what kind of resources you have of time, of supports, of energy left over, When you have a lot of high need students concentrated in one building, you're going to see a lot of those resources going to one thing instead of what other parents might prefer to see. So I think when I chose to send my daughter to a school that had a higher poverty level, a lot of black and brown students, I definitely felt like people thought that was not a great choice, that I got questioned on that I was making, a certain calculation or a trade-off that they didn't agree with. And I think people, whether they're explicitly thinking through that or not, when they look at a school,
absolutely,
and when they decide a school, are sort of thinking in those terms.
And I don't think that, you didn't say this, I'm saying this, but I don't even think that that's like a white-black thing. Like, I know, like, listen, obviously, if I chose to send my kid to a certain school, my family, my brother, my aunts would be like, why are you sending him to that school? And I get it. And also, don't those schools even start with the smaller pot from the gate? Like, they just have a smaller budget, no?
Well, so this is where it gets complicated.
Okay, this is what I don't understand, and I'm sure no one else does.
To put a pin on that choice that we all make, I would ask everyone to think about if they are making those choices and why they're making those choices. Because for me, I was losing some value and maybe some of that enrichment that wasn't going to be present in that school, and I knew that. I felt confident in my ability to supplement that at home. It was so annoying when my daughter was little. I would always say, I homeschool, but I also send my daughter to a brick and mortar school. Whatever. But I do believe in that.
Well, you believe in educating your kids.
And taking them to museums and things like that. But I saw and still do see an incredible value in having her attend school to be socialized. As well as being trained in academics and prepared for the workforce. I want her to be part of a society and be a good citizen, a good neighbor, just a good person. And for me, the value in her being around a variety of people was critical to do that. So were there maybe some trade-offs I had to make sure she was in an environment like that? Sure.
Yeah.
Do I think it was worth it? Absolutely. She's almost done with school, and I feel like I can still see the benefits. But everyone's making different choices.
And don't you think it's very dependent on each child's personality, like, or not? No. I love picking your brain.
You
because,
do. I don't. I think
and that's fine. I love that. Yeah.
Because I think we are a society of diverse people, including diverse personalities, and I think that. I guess I'm a believer in the comprehensive school idea where, you create a microcosm of society and every person's needs should be able to be addressed in that space, which means that every personality type should be able to navigate that space with low risk of what I think you're thinking about is that you have a school which has a lot of high needs kids, you're going to have we assume we're going to have a lot of negative behaviors, and there's some truth to that, which we can get into the types of resources that we can provide to make sure that doesn't happen as much. We're meeting kids' needs so they don't act out. But anyway, so I understand this idea that you create this high-risk environment where you have a lot of kids who might be acting out, and that certain kids are going to be drawn towards that like a flame. And I'm sure there is truth in that, but it's like, how do you create...
No, I'm saying that would have been me. I would have been drawn to that flame, but go ahead.
But it's like, how do you create an environment where you mitigate that and make it possible for that kid, that moth kid, to function and not be drawn? And quite frankly, I think one of those things is, if we're meeting the needs of high-risk children who are more likely to act out, then they're not going to act out, then there's no flame to be drawn to.
Sure.
That would be the ideal, right?
Right.
And I know that sounds like some sort of idealistic, impossible thing. I just don't think that it is.
So I think where we are definitely on the same point or on the same place is like idealism. Like I agree that we can get there.
Yeah.
And I'm really not disagreeing with you at all.
Yeah.
But like, I don't think it exists right now.
How much risk do you expose yourself to get there? Well, and where that's...
And how do we build that? Like, how do we build that utopia?
Well, and that's the thing. It's like every parent is trying to think about how much risk are they exposing their kids to? What are their priorities? What do they value in terms of exposing their child to whoever they want to expose their child to, and at what expense to their child's really economic future is what it comes down to. People are thinking about their child's everyday physical safety and mental health. But they're also thinking about, I want this kid to be a genius and go to Harvard or whatever and provide for me in my old age, and just be happy and healthy. And they are looking for school environments that are lowering the risk of harm to both of those things. where it's complicated is I don't know how we fix it without participating in it. I'm a big believer that you cannot,
Absolutely.
you can't remove yourself from a public system really without essentially making the choice to perpetuate the way that system currently exists. Because the public systems respond to people who are paying attention to them, people who are involved in them, and people who have the social and political capital to demand that they be what they need to be.
Sure.
I mean, that's true in like every social and political system. So if you are not participating in the public school system, you probably don't really know what's going on in it.
I definitely
you may
didn't.
care in a theoretical way, but you don't know enough. You're not investing of yourself in it to the point of where you're probably going to really be able to target your energies to make it better. And if your child is in a school, you better believe you're going to, I mean, what I did, I wanted my child to be in the type of school that threw a harvest festival every year. That was important to me.
I dig it.
My hippie sort of, wide-eyed mom thing. I'm like, that's what I wanted. And so I got together with a couple other parents and we made sure that school threw a big harvest festival every year. Hi, how are you?
Hello.
And I was driven to do that for my kid. I was also acutely aware that I was benefiting 350 other kids whose parents didn't have the time and the privileges that I did to organize a harvest festival. Like and to me that's why you want to bring people who have that, capital or experience or whatever. I mean, that's just one silly example, but
it's a really good example.
To say this is what our kids deserve to have. And that ends up bleeding into much more important areas than a harvest festival. But that's an important part of a school climate. It's like what do our kids deserve, and who has the bandwidth and the capital to fight for it and make it happen. A better example, it was another mom who was like, our school doesn't have a guidance counselor, which is probably a personal, interest to you, being married to a guidance counselor.
Right. Now, if you say guidance counselor, she will bite your face off. You've got to say counselor.
Counselor?
See, I just got brownie points. Because
I'm so sorry, Lisa.
I have been all over the place for saying it over and over again.
A counselor. So we did not have a full-time counselor, and so we had a parent who had the bandwidth, to sort of even recognize that. I had to be honest, my priorities were focused on the arts scene, and I'm thinking, we need to have a live music for our kids. She was thinking, where's the counselor? And figured out a way to get the district to ensure that we assigned a unit, now we can get back into funding systems, to our school so that we had the flexibility to actually have a full-time counselor. And that counselor, what that then opened up, in that year that she personally single-handedly advocated for that was we had this counselor who wasn't just sitting in an office, as we all know counselors don't do. That person was some people have these impressions from school as to whether or not we participated.
Some of them do,
but this person was conducting essentially gifted programming. He was doing literary circles for students all over the building. He was doing support groups for students who were bereft, students who had parents who were incarcerated. The things that this person had the time to do to help all of the students, just because one parent was thinking for her 3 kids who were in the school, this seems weird that we don't have this thing, and I noticed, so we used to do that all the time. As a PTA, with a very small fraction of the parents in that school building, were active in that PTA, we would look on the website of North Star and say, what do they have that we don't have, and how do we make sure that we get that? So we were able to do things like ask the district to help us fund an Odyssey the Mind program, which is this nerdy program that we do. It's like a problem-solving competition. All the other schools seem to be involved in it. Our school wasn't, because we didn't have parents who could afford to pay all the fees. So we asked the district. The district helped us foot that bill, and then we were able to provide that for more students, even students whose parents didn't know to advocate for that. And we had a couple instances like that. And I think, so for me, that's kind of where I come back to the issue of why in our current context, socioeconomic integration is really important, because you have parents with social and political capital in the space demanding the best for their kids and benefiting kids whose parents have not yet had the opportunity to understand their rights and responsibilities, and all the great things that they deserve as well, because probably those parents never even got exposed to those assets when they were in school, in
they don't even know what they're missing, what they're not missing. Or they don't know what they're missing.
They don't know what they're missing.
Yeah.
And so, I think that's important, and for better or for worse, I think it will continue to be important. And I use the word socioeconomic integration because I don't think it's necessarily, I know people quibble over the point of like, it's not just about a white kid and a black kid sitting next to each other. I see value in that personally.
I definitely do.
That's something that's important to me. I would not put that on someone else as a value necessarily. But when you have people who have more, economic power, and that person could hopefully be any color. We're working to make sure it's more people of color that we can say that about. And you have a building of all black students, and their parents are coming from different economic backgrounds, then you will also see, more money, more social and political capital, more demand for the best, and that benefiting more students. But when you remove that element of just demand for your rights from a school building, that parent power piece, you get under-resourced, and you get sort of an acceptance of under-resourcing the schools. So like when you said, do the schools just have less resources, lower budgets from the jump? No and yes. So we have this 80-year-old, might be 85 by now, way that we fund our schools called the unit count system.
Okay.
It has some merits, and it has some flaws. And basically what it does is it allocates units that represent personnel, essentially, on the basis of how many students are in a building.
Sure.
So there is a quality in that system, right? So like, you have school A over here and school B over here, and they both have the same number of students. They're generating the same number of units with which to hire educators, administrators, specialists, and so on and so forth. So that seems equal, but then if you really look at it, each unit is going to be, let's say, they're educators. They each get like 20 educators in the building. One school environment might be able to attract educators with more years of experience, higher degree attainment. Maybe you have like master's levels teachers with 10 years of experience, and they've got school A or school B to pick from. And those qualifications lead to a difference in how much that person is paid, totally justifiably, right? I mean, you've spent 20 years teaching and you have a master's degree, you're going to be paid more.
Absolutely.
And so if you have 20 teachers who are all on that higher level of the spectrum in this building, and then maybe over here you have 20 teachers who are all brand new with bachelor's degrees.
Right.
You add up the value of those people, and all of a sudden you've got more money invested here than here. So why would that happen? That doesn't make sense. So that again is complicated. So say school A in this example is a suburban school, very little poverty, probably very little diversity of any kind.
Not too much disciplinary problems to worry with. Right.
And then school B is that high poverty school we were describing, where there's just a ton of need and all of the things that come with that. And, theoretically, they both have the same budget to spend of units for staff. But we were talking about it before. These kids need a lot more behavioral health supports. And when they don't get all the behavioral health supports that they need, that is putting a lot more on the plate of educators to fill in the gaps of providing behavioral health supports.
Right.
When they were trained to educate, to instruct on academic subjects or maybe artistic specials and things like that, they're now stepping in social work capacities, in psychology capacities, because maybe we're not, because they're trying to find room in that same budget to fulfill all those needs in the building. And then over here, they don't have maybe the same level of need. They certainly have it. Every school has it. I don't care how wealthy or poor you are. But over here, though, then they have, we have 3 extra teachers. Let's start a Chinese program. Let's offer some other types of things. We can have a full-time gifted teacher. Whereas over here, and my child was enrolled in a school much like this one, we had we had part-time specialists for all of the exploratory specials. We had a part-time gifted teacher in all but maybe 1 or 2 years. And it makes a difference. There's just sort of less there to work with. And when we had full-time specialists, those people were able to do so much engagement with the families who needed a lot more effort put into the engagement because we were coming from higher need communities. And it made such a huge difference. But we were sort of scraping for the resources to do those things and lost them after a couple of years for whatever reason, I don't recall. Whereas over here, it's just sort of steadily flowing. So it's really more this dynamic of inequity where the system creates equality that doesn't work because the need is not equal.
Gotcha. Now, but okay, so even when we get down to stuff like, schools that don't have books and torn up books and they can't afford, uniforms for sports, where did that, allocation get drained?
Where does that come from?
You know what I mean? Let me make sure we're still running.
Oh,
keep
okay.
going. I'm just
So that again, there's not really a good excuse, I would say, to not have up-to-date technology or materials. I have been in schools.
Where did that money go? And I'm not saying that someone stole it by any means. I'm just saying, where did the money?
It's a good question, and we should always follow the money. I think there are other. There's just a lot of pressing needs that come, before a district when it comes to the upkeep of the buildings and the refreshing of the materials and all these types of things. And districts have different challenges that they're facing, whether it's the number of students in poverty that they have, the numbers of students with disabilities that they have, and all these types of things. For me, in my semi-professional opinion, mostly unprofessional opinion, of where I decided to put my effort was you see less attention to maintenance of those things in a building where no one's noticing and demanding better. I think that tends to come from primarily parents putting that pressure on, also the educators and administrators, but if you have educators and administrators who are burnt out by a lack of resources overall to support having a great climate in their school, and they're just advocating for that, it becomes harder for them, I think, to advocate and address all of these things. And then when you don't have that parent political power to demand better, it just sort of becomes sort of a quietly accepted thing. And that's why I think when you see a high poverty school...
See, I always just kind of assume, because I'm not I have been in enough different schools to see clear differences, but I always just kind of incorrectly assume that it's they literally don't have the money. You know what I mean?
Well,
and maybe sometimes they
don't because they're making hard choices about how to spend that money.
Right, but
and we might disagree on how they've decided to spend that money.
It's totally, I'm sure it's very individualized at each school.
Yes.
It's gotta be.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's very specific. It has to be.
Yeah. And so it's frustrating, I think, and this has been a conversation that's happened for the last several years, is how do we make it easier for the public to engage with the expenditures of public schools and districts so that we can understand as we advocate. So I remember, when I was doing the PTA president thing and trying to look at the school budget, it was so difficult to understand for me. And I thought, I had a pretty decent education and I'm certainly not an accountant by any stretch of the imagination, but it just was so difficult to connect the dots between where does the money come from and where does the money go? And that makes it harder for even an educated and very engaged parent to navigate, let alone, sort of the average parent who wants to kind of look at a glance and understand.
Is it mainly the principal who's responsible for disseminating all of that? Obviously they get their money from the district, but
it's a combination of school-based and district-based expenditures, and that ends up being a big part of the conversation about how do we reform it.
Right.
Do we push more funding flexibly down to the school level so that the principals can be making more of those decisions, because they don't necessarily make as many of them as you would think.
No, that makes sense.
And that's often the crux too of the charter versus traditional school district debate, because when you have a charter school, you kind of are collapsing the district administration and the school level administration into one. So you're kind of closing the distance between those decisions theoretically.
Yeah.
And I think the idea being that then that enables you to really focus your your expenditures on that population that you're serving. I think that's the philosophy behind it that most people would use to make the case, but obviously the difference between a charter and a traditional district school is a lot more complicated in that in terms of the pros and cons to doing it, which we can certainly get into, and I'm sure we'll get yelled at by people who disagree with us.
I don't think there's any obviously there's more than one approach to any problem, but
Sure.
everything you're saying makes sense.
But I think at the end of the day, it's like, what approach do you choose? I mean, you can do a both and I'm all for, like, let's try all the things, you know, to try to address problems. But I do think, and I take responsibility for this as an elected official, that we have an obligation to lean into the types of solutions that are going to be the best for the most people.
Sure.
And so if there are solutions that are fantastic for 10 people but bad for 10,000, that's not great.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we have to always be looking at the balance of that, and how do we make sure that we are doing the best for the most kids, and just making sure that our policies drive that and incentivize that. And I think, you know, when it comes to things like those types of school structures or choice mechanisms and things like that, we really have a lot of revisiting to do to make sure that we are not just empowering the strongest folks in the system. You know, I feel like I'm speaking vaguely around the edges of it, but we can get into it if you want to. But that we are empowering everyone to get a wonderful education. So, you know, I know not everyone feels this way, but I was raised to believe that American public education is, you know, this jewel on the crown of what our country could be.
Maybe it used to be.
Well,
I said that, not you. This is my opinion, but go ahead.
And the best education, you can get the best education in the world in an American public school. I was raised absolutely to believe.
That's the ideal.
My grandmother was a common school teacher in a one-room schoolhouse in Lancaster County. Mm-hmm. It's awesome. I have this photo that I'd be happy to share. She actually...
I forgot that Lancaster.
She taught in the 1920s. Mm-hmm. She's white, or was white, obviously, but her school was integrated, and I love that picture
in Lancaster
so much. Yeah, Pennsylvania had integrated, particularly in rural areas.
But I mean, I'm just surprised that it was even. Yeah. There were that many, you know, minorities in Lancaster that could sort of.
Yeah, it's kind of a funny
mean?
picture
at that
because, like,
time.
The black kids seem like more middle class than the white kids, who seem like pretty rough. So it's kind of a funny dynamic, but they probably felt like they had to be, you know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cross every T, dot every I. But but I love that photo, and I think it's really cool. And then on my father's side, you know, he was, you know, a black.
Where's your dad from?
Kennett Square is where he grew up.
Okay.
So we kind of have Kennett Square Hockessin roots.
Yeah.
And people hear that and they're like, oh, bougie. It was not bougie.
No.
Yeah. In the beginning of the 20th century. Okay. Yeah. These were places where people who
because even wasn't Hockessin like sort of it was a black community.
Well, there is. There's still Chippy Chapel.
Right.
And like that whole area, right?
So,
and obviously the old colored school, you know, there's remnants of the black community. And these are places where people who in the not too far past had been slaves, right? And so their skills were in agricultural work. Yep. And this is where agricultural work was available. So anyway, my dad ended up in Kennett Square growing up, and he was obviously vastly the minority at the time. But his public school education that he had there, in a very integrated environment, sort of, or white-dominated environment, it did mean a lot to him, and I think he felt that it changed his life and was crucial. And I think the vast majority of Americans still attend public schools.
Of course.
It is extremely important that we have a great public school system to continue to reach towards making sure that the best education you can get in the world is an American public school. If that's no longer true, and I felt like I got a great education, and I've seen it for others as well, many others.
It just depends on your district. That's the problem, right?
But that's the thing. I
problem.
felt like lots of kids had access.
Like rich people can get a good public education, but poor kids can't, and that's the main problem.
And how many people can avail themselves of that best education available in the public system?
Like I have friends who are literally like, should I move to Delaware and pay for private school, or should I live in say Avondale and pay the taxes but get a good public school system?
So why is that true, right?
Right.
So why would that be true that it used to feel like you could go to a public school and work hard and be a motivated student and pretty easily access good courses, a strong degree, go on to some level of success? Why does that now feel more elusive?
Yes.
When we've added supposedly a lot more opportunities for my daughter goes to charter school Wilmington. Okay.
Yeah. And it's a nice school with nice facilities. And, I run at that track.
But it's a limited number of kids who can take advantage of that. And I guess for me the question is that I don't have the data on necessarily is how many more students are getting that quote unquote excellent education now than were 20 years ago,
Right.
40 years ago, and why? Are we making it harder to reach those resources? And what policies are making that happen? Is it because we're making it sort of an exclusive building that you have to get into to have a great education? And then what happens in the building where there used to be a variety of different kids, a socioeconomic mix of kids at our high schools, for example. And then when we create these different places where kids can go, and there's no parameters around who can go there, so they end up kind of being, the word I'm thinking of I don't want to say out loud, segregation academies, where people with means and resources, they're not all white people,
No.
people of color as well, go and sequester themselves. Then the other high schools end up becoming places where only the lowest income struggling people are. And then we already talked about the dynamic of what happens when you have a concentration of socioeconomic deprivation versus a concentration of abundance. And what that means for how resources can get spent, and just what the climate is going to be like, and therefore what foundation you have to achieve great things. So it seems like we're creating more spaces like this, but why? I mean, it could be just to make the fewer spaces that look like this. If you get access to one, you're happy. I
almost think it's a form of. I think that the bottom line is people are not willing to take any risks on their kids' education.
Well,
I'm hedging my bets to where I know this is going to win. It's pretty much that simple. You know what I mean? Especially because it's getting harder and harder to get a good education.
And I get super aggravated with my friends like you for making those choices. I'm like, why private school? Why this? Why this charter school where they're
hedging my bets selfishly? I'm selfishly hedging my bets.
So while that makes me mad when I see people make those choices, I also then say to myself, how could you possibly blame any human being for navigating a system to the most benefit for themselves? That's that's like what we're engineered to do. We're not engineered to sit there and go, I'm going to analyze the history and the political implications of my choice 20, 40 years into the future. No human being is doing that every day to day. It's like, where am I going to send my child to kindergarten where I feel like they will be safe and well educated, and if there's some good socializing happening, that's a nice icing on the cake, but I can do without it. So of course people are going to choose that way because they have their own crap to be worried about, their jobs and their other types of things, or maybe they're not thinking about it at all.
I think it's all
and
of those
enrolling their
things.
child in a school where they're getting the short end of the stick and not even knowing it.
It's all of those things.
So to me, that's what all these things that we talk about are ultimately systemic, and I think it's our job, those of us who do have the wherewithal to pay attention or now that I'm elected, have power over the systems, have an obligation to create systems that change the incentives, which is basically like, how do we lower the risk? How do we create a system that enables people to make choices that are more beneficial to all students? And I think we have, unfortunately, and we could talk all day about, was it intentional, wrongdoing, or was it an accidental side effect? But I think we've created a system where we are encouraging people to make choices that benefit only themselves and disregard the needs of others. So then it really shouldn't be shocking when we end up with a system that maybe is hurting more than it's harming, or perpetuating a more mediocre outcomes than phenomenal ones, because we're not challenging ourselves to do the best.
Isn't it a lot like, and I want to keep saying that I think you're right.
Thank you.
Okay?
It's great to be right and not get what I want.
I think that your approach is correct and doable, and I think it's kind of fundamentally revolutionary, and it's fundamentally it's like the idea, like if you have to change the word, you change yourself. Like you're throwing yourself and making yourself part of what you want to fix, and you don't have to necessarily.
No.
Right? But it's like,
but out of sight, out of mind. That was literally a thing that was crossing my mind when I was enrolling my daughter in school. Was like, I wanted her to be with her neighbors. I also was very aware of shortcomings in the system. I'd done some work around it. I read Jonathan Kozol in college, okay? So I knew that there were fundamental issues. But I was like, well, yeah, but if I remove myself from that, I'm not going to do any work to solve this problem.
But it's no different than kind of picking where you choose to live, right? Where you buy a home. Isn't it very similar? Like, it's like, listen, I'm not going to move in the most dangerous part of Wilmington.
Right.
But if I did, you could probably serve that community a lot, but maybe that's a little bit too much of a risk.
Well, we all have our threshold. If we're talking about being woke people.
But my threshold should probably be a little bit more communal than it is, right?
I mean, if we're thinking about where are we ordering, if we have the wokeness to think about where are we shopping, where are we spending our money, and things like that, I think we can maybe think a little bit about what are our thresholds. I didn't choose to send my daughter to the toughest school ever. She went to Highland, she went to HB, and now she's at Charter. So obviously the scale. I obviously burnt myself out early, but. Because there was an investment of my time I felt that was required to just be the present mom when she was in elementary. That tends to happen anyway, that you're more involved in elementary and then less as you go along. But anyway, and I think we tend to make this decision, this is whether you send your kid to a private school or a school like Charter School Wilmington, that like, oh, well, if they're in that school, I can be less present. That's actually never true. Right. Anyway, well, we should always be present for our kids.
You want me to make you really barf? is how much I am already involved at my child's school.
Isn't it fun?
And it's fun, but it's like
bring back the Harvest Festival. No.
But it's like good. Not that I'm a good person, but good people are needed everywhere.
Sure.
You know what I'm saying? So. Even though I'm making a completely opposite decision in terms of, where I'm starting my kids.
Completely opposite.
Completely opposite.
Completely.
There is a need for my presence there, too, in a almost different way. It's not as much of a need, but like all those black kids who were there, like, what in the world is this? The fact that I'm there, like, hey, let me walk you through this.
Yes, I think there's validity in that.
You know what I'm saying?
But part of that calculation of like, we're thinking about our risk factor for our own individual child and putting them into whatever space that is.
Yep.
And that's going to look different probably for a lot of people, for a lot of reasons. I think part of that calculation has to be like, well, what am I perpetuating by making this choice? If we have the power to influence, to start chipping away at ultimately dismantling systems that aren't okay with us.
Yeah.
And if we want to talk about things like, fundamentally white supremacist systems that we want to transform to serve everyone.
But can't you transform that from the inside out too?
It depends. I mean, I was definitely raised to believe that you transform from within. But I do think there's a difference between public and private.
Yes.
In terms of to what extent it perpetuates those types of norms. And I think that public systems, whether or not they have fulfilled that potential, and we have plenty of stones to throw at them for doing white supremacist or structurally racist things. However, they are publicly governed.
So
we own them. We pay for them.
No.
We can actually change them, whereas a private school, you're paying money, you're present, you're there, but like really the system kind of belongs to someone else. They could choose to change. You
know what's funny? Like
I don't know. Prove me wrong.
No, I'm not trying to prove you wrong. I think you're right. I've said it like 5 times. But it's like what's really funny about even my experience thus far has been okay. It's a case in point of how much the public school system needs to change, because throughout all of this been going on with all of the social change that we've been seeing and all of the revolutionary stuff that we've been seeing. My wife works in the public school system. I'm used to the private school system. My school could, on IG, super fast, Black Lives Matter. They had a black box up there the day, like they were on it. They're still doing stuff. All kinds of like progressive stuff, speaking to these issues and having groups and Zoom sessions about this stuff. Meanwhile, the public school, silent. And these are the kids who need to have, we need to have their backs even more. You know what I'm saying? And, leadership there is like, well, that's not our job. Silent.
Well,
silent.
It depends on the system.
Like the school that you would expect least to speak out first, spoke out first, which is a big problem. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And
they had a lot of complaints.
Yeah, but you would see. No, come on, watch this. Watch this. My brother left that school to go to your school, and for the first time in his life, got called a nigger by a teacher.
Really? By a teacher?
By his coach.
I mean, no, it definitely happens in our public schools. Don't get me wrong.
And
the recourse should be there, and I think some of that again falls down to who is making decisions, who's participating in decision. It comes back again to participation. So do I think that our public schools have perfectly realized that? Absolutely not. But that's why, after I did my education policy degree, I went to work for an organization that was meant to grow parent power and engagement and work on growing, the room for parent engagement and decision making in our schools, because I think there is a lack of that. There is sort of a locked down quality. And of course, I trust educators and administrators as experts, but the community has got to have a voice with teeth in those spaces if you're actually going to see progress. And I think that is something that's missing on the school level. I think it's something that's missing probably on the district level as well. But I mean, also a public school district is a bureaucracy, and nothing happens overnight in public school districts. Not public statements, not policy changes or anything, because it is public.
Right.
I mean, we could get into the whole SRO debate, but like that again, when you have tens of thousands of people who are citizens in a system, you do have an obligation to engage with all stakeholders on their feelings on the issue and come to a common decision, which will probably involve some compromise when you're talking on a full district level. Down to the school level, it's a little bit more handleable. It's a smaller community.
Yeah.
So again, like a charter school, a private school is collapsed into one building's worth of community to which to respond, and that is naturally going to be a faster response time.
Of course.
I think. I mean, does that necessarily mean that the systems are fundamentally changed when you have those conversations and make statements? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. Like, I have another question.
Yes.
So, legislatively, what can you do to create the kinds of changes that you want to see? You know what I'm saying? Like, what can you do from your role, like down in Dover? How can politicians affect change? Because it sounds like from your end, the main thing that needs to happen is from the people who go to that school, from the actual community. Like, they have to be involved, and it starts really more at that level.
Well, it's both. I mean, you have to encourage the grassroots. You have to encourage things to come up from the ground up.
Sure.
But that means you have to create a context that is receptive to that. And you have to push on whatever makes it possible for that to occur. But you also have to be thinking at the same time about how do we make sure that context also, protects people's rights and does all these other types of things. So it's like that push-pull between like local control and centralized policy making that is always happening, and that I don't know that we've really figured out perfectly yet. But like, so I think we have to figure out how to create a school system that does encourage that grassroots engagement. And I think charter school policy and choice policy was an approach to do that, right? It wasn't maybe what I'm talking about, which is empower every parent in every school to help design that school, but it is in a way that was saying each parent gets to choose which school they think is the lowest risk for their child, essentially. I mean, we frame it differently, but that's kind of what I think most parents are doing. And then also, with a charter school, you can design the school. That sounds great. That is like the ultimate local control. But I think on the state level, what our responsibility is, how do we create a policy context that allows that flourishing and innovation to occur in a way that does not lead to discrimination against any vulnerable student group. So, if we have enabled, a school to be born that, a certain segment of the community is really excited that it exists, and they created it and it belongs to them, and that should be the ultimate, right? But then what that leads to is you're not seeing a lot of low-income students admitted. You're not seeing a lot of students with disabilities admitted, students of color in general. That is a systemic big no-no, big boo-boo that we have created. So it's like, how do we balance those two things? I think on the state level, we have to figure out how do we put policies in place that enable a landscape that can do both of those things. So create space in our district schools or other, types of schools to let the community in, to let, I think we talk a lot about administrators make the decisions they need to make with the resources that they need in those spaces, but also to make sure that we're protecting everyone so that we have a full landscape of schools where there aren't bad schools.
Right.
So if we do a policy that does that one thing really well in a few isolated ways, but is worsening the problem in terms of having some other students disenfranchised, that wasn't a great solution. Or it needs modification, right? We need to revisit why that's happening and how can we tweak it and improve it so that we have a landscape of schools that are all strong, because whatever the composition of that school building in terms of the wealth or poverty, it's getting the resources it needs to be stable, calm, productive environment. The educators are getting the supports they need so they can do what they want to do. So it's kind of those pieces. It's like how do we make sure that the resources are being provided for schools to be successful?
And you can do that from your end, like as a state senator.
We hold the
like
purse strings.
You do. Okay, I was making sure I understand that.
It's sort of at the end of the day, probably the biggest part of it. I mean, we pass the state budget.
Okay.
The governor pitches it. We sort of approve it, tweak it, make other suggestions. We can change the funding formula for our schools.
Right. Okay.
That is
Okay.
completely up to us to revise.
Where does the school board fall in that? The district boards.
They decide.
So
okay.
they get the big chunk. Break it all down for us.
This is a good question.
Yeah.
This is so I think where people often get confused is like what controls are between state and between local. So like on the local level, they're making a lot of decisions about policies around how curriculum is going to be delivered, right? Or what curriculum they're going to use.
Yes.
The state level might set like standards, and the federal too, right? We have standards of things that should be taught, but on the local level, curriculum is decided. And then really down to like the school level, it's like, well, what does that actually look like in practice? Like ideally, it should be all the way down to an educator doing their job as a professional educator as to how to deliver best to the children in front of them. So it's sort of, it's that sort of sliding scale of what kind of decisions are being made to be responsive to the people before you. So we are more the context setters, set standards, provide broadly the funding in order for districts and schools to spend it on what they know it needs to be spent on. And do we create more parameters? Do we create less parameters on that? We have the power to do that, but there's a lot of debate about how much do we want to do that. Right now, funding is very much tied to allocation of personnel, and some people really like that, and others say no, it should be like an unfettered bag of cash to spend on whatever you want. I'm probably more on I like guardrails because I think it's good for kids, and I think if it's spending it on the personnel, I think that has a lot of validity in it. But so what else can we do on the state level? We can address governance structures.
You know what? I have another. No, I'm going to stay in this place.
okay.
But I'm thinking as you're discussing this.
Go on forever and make.
So I don't want you to say names or anything, but like, okay, clearly you know education. Like you seem like.
I feel like I don't. I feel like it's like an endless. Do you know what I mean?
But you have a lot more knowledge than most people, I feel like, in terms of being able.
I
just think you understand the process. But I wonder, like, in terms of like, and I asked my dad this too, like. How many
he knows it.
Policy experts are really at the table? Because quite frankly, I could run for, this is not a knock, certainly not against you, but like, I know less than you about this, and I could run for office right now, become a state senator, and be making big decisions, not having any idea what I'm talking about.
Okay, and I think that might be what inhibits change. I don't think the lack of change in that area necessarily is coming from a place of ill will of like, it's good the way it is, let's keep it the way it is. I think it is a very complicated and opaque system for most people, most of us, and it is scary to change it. Because you're like, well, what if I get this wrong? I don't know what I'm talking about. I feel that way, and I've been trying to understand it for like a decade. So I understand it, but there's still, I know there's things you have to. But as a legislator, you have to be willing to lean on experts. And to undergo processes that make everybody else roll their eyes, like committees and task forces and consortiums. To navigate a process of coming up with good policy that allows you to own the fact that, hey, that you don't know everything.
I'm just saying so quickly as I'm really thinking about it, like how important it is for this to not be a popularity contest.
No.
And that's a lot of that.
But I mean, but again, as
you got to know your
legislators,
stuff and be able to really, like, it's not maybe an expectation for you to be
Yeah.
an education expert, but you got to have an education expert at the table giving you
Exactly.
guys information that you guys can sort through.
Right. I mean, it's good to have someone who's sensitive to the nuances. As a legislator, it's also important to have those people in our agencies, and we have so many experts in our agencies.
Right.
Or that we can lean on to bring in to the table community members we can bring in who have deep knowledge, like your dad, when we're having those conversations and trying to do that planning work. But, I mean, that's the thing. Legislators are making major decisions about all kinds of... none of us... I mean, some of us are not, I mean, I'm talking about myself, not my colleagues. I'm like, some of us aren't experts in anything. Like, we had to become generalists
Yeah.
in all these things and just know who to ask.
Right.
Because, of course, we're not going to be experts in everything.
You
I mean,
can't.
I'll have a bill come in front of me that's like, codify this new investment, sort of model. And I'm just like, I don't know anything about that. And you have to really quickly learn about it or figure out who you can trust to be a good arbiter of information on that. So yes, that's how that works. And I decided to go to Dover in large part because I wanted to see the funding formula revisited and reformed. And I'm aware that we have a lawsuit in play that may call for us to do that. Full disclosure, I was part of the genesis of that from a couple of different angles. And
that really is about
happening.
properly reallocating funds,
Yeah.
right? It's just fundamentally.
Yes.
Like money needs to go
It's
more
like,
to...
we need a better formula.
The people who have the least need more.
Yes.
And don't...
And then at the same time, it's like, but then I always feel like I'm the naysayer here. 'Cause I was just having a text conversation
I pay
about
all this tax money
Right.
to be in this district. You're not going to make my school district worse.
Right. But I was having a conversation this morning
It's not
with
gonna
a
get
friend
worse,
about
honey. These teachers aren't leaving.
like adult use of cannabis. And we were having this conversation. People were like, we need to just legalize it. I'm like, yes. It's just like saying we need to just fix the formula and make more money go to the more vulnerable students. But it's never that simple. The devil is always in the details. And it's like, sure, we could just say tomorrow selling cannabis is legal. But what are all of the things that we have to make sure are in place to also protect communities, create access for
Right.
communities? So this is what's difficult in policymaking. There's things where it's like, just legalize it. Just send more kids more money to the neediest students. It sounds easy.
No,
But there are a lot of things that you have to look out for. I mean, I
Yes.
would say, and I hate to belabor the point about choice policy, which I think needs to be reformed. It's like
Yeah.
25 years old, I think now. And I would love to see us revisit choice and charter law and look at how it has not lived up to its ideals in all ways and fix it. Again, I think when that was first formed, there was a sense of urgency. It's like, we just need to have choice and charter. We were a trailblazer in that way. That's kind of cool. But what's lost when you rush to get something done without really making sure you're doing it right?
Yeah.
So I probably am always that person who's like, let's think this through, guys, which is like super not sexy and exciting for the general public who want immediate action. But I think that that's the responsibility of a lawmaker.
I have yet to disagree with you. You know what I'm saying?
So we try to find those little things we can do fast.
Right.
And
What kinds of things can you do fast?
in
That's
education,
safely fast. No, across just in anything. Where is it like, okay, you know what? We can just change this real quick. You know what I mean? Is it like drinking laws or like, I
Oh,
guess some of the
man.
stuff that we've seen with quarantine, like those sort of, but that's almost like
well, I mean,
orders.
isn't that amazing to see what can happen faster than you think in terms
And that's
of providing
kind of-
resources to people like unemployment? and
So
stimulus
it's
funds.
like kind of both. I'm like,
Yeah.
you know, like
Well,
y'all
no,
can do.
I will tell you, quarantine and the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement have definitely challenged my approach in some way where I think I do have a certain level of patience, which is a privileged thing to have.
Sure.
When it comes to policymaking, where it's just like, these things take time. We have to get it right, guys. But then you also realize that we do have the ability to do a lot more and faster. I mean, something might need to take 6 months to plan, doesn't need 6 years. So it's like, how do we really think about what urgency looks like, and how quickly can we do things properly is probably faster than maybe what we accept. Is it tomorrow? Probably not. But it is probably faster than a 10-year path. I think I remember talking to one of my predecessors in the Senate about a bill that they had worked on just to create some transparency for the public in the system, and it literally took that person 7 years to accomplish what they thought was a pretty straightforward transparency measure. And so it's complicated. I do believe stakeholder engagement has to occur. We have processes in place for a reason to protect. But when it starts to become more about protecting the status quo than actually protecting and helping people, then we have to, I just think we have to challenge ourselves to do better. So I think this moment, has definitely called that into question for me, because I really have felt the weight of like standing out on Market Street on was it May 30th or June 1st?
Oh, I don't remember.
May 31st, right after the night of unrest, where it's just like the sense of urgency was huge, and knowing that the actual runway to changing the underlying problems that people are crying out about is so long, and you just feel an immense amount of guilt and like despair over that. So it's hard. I think there's a part of me who's like the social studies teacher who wants to explain to people there's processes and democratic things that have to occur, and that makes it take longer. And I do believe in that, but I also think that doesn't mean that it has to be as sluggish and full of barriers as we have perhaps made it.
So I come banging on your door.
Yeah.
Tizzy, God damn it, I'm tired of, listen, I need this to happen right now. Okay, great, we banned the chokeholds, great. But I need cameras on these officers
I'm going to defend that chokehold ban.
I need cameras on these officers ASAP.
Right.
I need a citizens oversight committee.
Yes.
I need their law of their code of conduct. All these things rewritten. Blah 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 blah. How do we get there? Like, how do we do that?
In Delaware, and I think both places democratically, usually, we do. We look at those priorities and we think, how fast can we do those? I can break it down.
And y'all are out of session right now, right? Like,
we are out of session,
until
but we're not.
When?
We go back into session in January.
Oh, wow.
But I think there's also people think, okay, you're in session is the only time you work. That should not be true. I think for most legislators, that is not true.
Okay.
We spend roughly 45 days on the floor voting on things. That is, for whatever, 3 to 6 or whatever hours each
This
of
is
those
just
days.
the state, though. The city is year-round, right?
They have a little, like a month-long break, I think. But yes, this is just the state, because the state's now what I know. But, that's a pretty compact amount of time, 45 days for 3 to 6 hours a day. It's not a lot, but that's when we're on the floor voting on the bills that we've created. Tons of time goes into looking at potential policies to developing those policies with stakeholders and experts, working on the policies that we develop with our colleagues to figure out what we can actually pass or how to modify those things.
Right.
So there's a lot that happens outside those session days, and I would say right now those things are happening. Probably some people are taking a little bit of a breather, but we're getting into the mode of making sure that we have policies to present. So I would say for the things that you listed,
like, what's next? We got the chokehold ban. What's next?
So it's a good example of different ways that different types of policies take different timelines. So like the hi, how are you? I wish you guys could see how cute she is.
Right.
So the chokehold ban was like a pretty easy thing to accomplish, because as folks know, there is generally speaking already an agreed
But that could have been
standard.
difficult, right? Depending
We
on
still had
who...
a long floor debate. But that was in part because while the name of it, which I probably am somewhat complicit in being like, everyone knows it as the chokehold ban. So people think we're just saying you can't do chokeholds. But we already don't do chokeholds, so that law did nothing. I understand people's sentiment on that, but what it actually did was it created a crime.
Okay.
So it actually created, a felony that someone specifically targeted towards law enforcement officers can be charged with, and therefore held accountable for, with the types of consequences that come from committing an actual crime.
Right.
So to me, that is an important way of saying, you can have a policy that just sounds good on paper but is not enforced. Does this guarantee enforcement? No, but it creates another very clear mechanism for enforcing
I appreciate
accountability.
that.
So
Right.
I want people to know that that's what we did. We didn't just say no chokeholds, everybody. We created a crime that if someone violates that generally accepted norm, they will be charged with that.
Right. And I think, number one, it's a step. It's certainly a step, and it's a necessary step.
And that was easy because everybody agrees no one should be doing it. So it's
Right.
not a leap to say, let's make sure that if they violate that norm, that they are charged with something.
Right. But not the counter
that was
to it.
easy.
But the concern is that
Easy.
In New York, they were banned, and Eric Garner, got choked out, and no one was held accountable.
Right.
So that is like, okay, great, but like we know that could potentially still not prevent.
But were they banned? Like, do they have a crime against committing it, or were they just?
I don't know if it's a policy.
That's a difference.
Right, you made an actual law. Okay,
yeah,
okay.
It's a lot of our agencies had the policy of we don't do chokeholds, but like you said, it occurs, and we're saying you all say this is not a policy you follow. Let's prove it. Mm-hmm. Then you should have no problem with it being on the books that this is a crime when it's done because it's not our policy. And that was why it was very doable, because the vast majority of folks in law enforcement strongly agreed no one should be doing this and they should be held accountable if they do it. So that's what made that a bill that was able to become law within like 2 weeks.
Okay.
And that is unusual. And I am thankful that we were able to do that because it is rare. Even though it feels like a small thing, like that is, to me, I hope that is a signal that we are willing to continue that. But you never know. Sometimes it's like, all right, we did that thing, we don't have to do anything else. But our hope is that's a signal that we can keep going. So then you talked about cameras. So having a statewide requirement
Well, what
for
do
cameras.
you think should be next? Like, what would be a good step
well,
next
all the
for
things
you?
on the list that we did, which
okay.
are many of the things that you mentioned.
Okay.
So the bill in that, well, I'm going to talk about the cameras next. So having a statewide requirement that everyone wear body cams, which again, we get, I hear the residual criticism that we're like, we've got people with body cams, they are turned off, they're not working, yada, yada.
Yep.
I hear that. But again, creating space that could be a form of monitoring that we could have does make sense. Mm-hmm. So why is that not something we could pass in 2 weeks? That's because providing technology to all of our agencies, or requiring them to provide technology to all of their officers, has a big fiscal impact. And so whenever you're asking people to do something that costs money, that is going to be a longer process, because it's like, well, where's the money coming from? You know, who's providing these funds, and blah, blah, blah. So that automatically makes that that's a January bill, right? Because it's like, well, we have to not just design the bill, which is not as heavy of a lift. We have to figure out how are we going to provide for that to happen, because we have some teeny tiny agencies that probably cannot, if we made that a law tomorrow, they can't afford to actually comply. And that's not fair.
Nope.
So we have to figure out how do we make sure that we're helping not make it impossible for an agency to comply. So that makes a longer runway, 6 months, right? So hopefully we'll be able to figure that out and do that, pretty expediently as well, but that just makes it harder when you bring money into it.
I gotta say, just off what you're saying now, that it makes the previous podcast that I did with Lieutenant Seligman a lot more. It makes what he said make a lot more sense, because everything he was saying was. It didn't cost anything. You know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah, and I was listening to that too, and I thought this is great. These are things that can be done on that local agency level, that they don't need the state to tell them what to do. We don't need to wait. Like legislators, we're not magicians who can fix all the things. We can't legislate behavior. We don't, we're even limited sometimes in making sure people actually do the things that we do legislate.
It'd been funny if I fell there.
That would have been hilarious.
Yeah. You see me go ahead over, but go ahead.
But yeah, I mean, there's different levels of government for a reason, because different agencies have different responsibilities for making things happen. And we could circle back to the education conversation on that, because, some of the work that I'm doing around creating a better context for education on the state level, it's not going to hit all those things. Local education agencies, school districts, and the charter schools, they are the deciders on a lot of stuff, because we're very locally controlled. And I would say,
you say that, I think George Bush, I'm the decider.
I'm the decider.
I'm the decider, but go ahead.
And they have the power to do a lot of things. We can create policies that essentially incentivize them to do things that we want. The federal government is really good at doing that, to force our hand on things on a state level. So as a state, we can create policies that incentivize local actions, which then will incentivize even individual behaviors. But they could do those things without us forcing their hand. So like when I talk about choice or, you know, student assignment, the composition of schools and how that's problematic, local education agencies, school district boards, superintendents have the power to make those changes at any time, and they do meet monthly. So they can make big changes without the state stepping in on some of these fronts. And one of the things that we're doing as a state is, you know, we created the Reading Consortium for Educational Equity. Representative Noam Chomsky and I passed the bills that created that. And one of the things that we are hoping comes out of it, and I think the coronavirus pandemic is helping crystallize this vision, is just coordination across LEAs on what good policies are and be consistent across LEAs to do that. They don't need us to tell them what they know what to do. They might need a little push or a conversation that everyone is part of, and then to communicate to us what policies will enable them to do those things. But so it's like, it's that task force thing, which I was getting to on the list of things. We got through 2. Chokeholds and cameras. And then what were the other 2 things that you were the
police oversight,
citizen oversight committee, and was I think also the law enforcement officer bill of rights. Was that,
yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
What you were talking
You're
about?
better than me. Remember what I said? See, that's why you're in office, girl. You're good. You're good.
This is what we were working on for the last 2 weeks. What can we do? I mean, we were looking at the list of demands and proposals from the NAACP, from you know, some of the things that the Attorney General was interested in, and other groups. You know, community groups whose names are going to escape me right now, and looking at those lists and literally going through and being like, what can we do fast, and what is longer term, and all that kind of stuff. I don't necessarily know for what reason putting together a citizen review board is a longer term proposal, although I have had some conversations. You know, they're pulling stuff together. Councilman Chris Johnson is pulling some stuff together on the city level.
He pulled in Seligman, actually.
Yes.
Yeah, which is really cool.
It's very cool, and you know, they can do that and do something that's external to the law enforcement agency, which I know was something that the community was looking for. And so my initial assumption was all of our executive branches could definitely do those things pretty quickly. But then, of course, there's complications. We're hearing from advocates on all sides. It makes it difficult. So I think that ended up just getting swept into the Law Enforcement Accountability Task Force that we established, where we can have a deeper conversation about what that needs to look like. Because, again, sometimes expedient isn't going to get you what you want. I think if we had an overnight establishment of citizens review boards, there probably is a good chance that they would have been established within the law enforcement agencies, and I don't think that would have made the community happy. So now it's kind of rolled into a longer term conversation about what are our priorities to deliver. And I had conversations with some of the strongest advocates for that in the beginning, where I literally was like, you do not want this to go through the legislature unless you're okay with an 18-month timeline of conversation.
Right.
Of, you know, we're going to have a committee to talk about the parameters before we even get to the point of any establishing legislation. And I mean, that's something that we do. That's actually not a terrible timeline, but for community members that want something shorter term, it's extremely frustrating, and I get that. So now we're kind of looking at, you know, from my perspective as a legislator in Wilmington, how can I support what's being established in my municipality that I live in, to make it easier for them to do their work. So I know that they're interested in, like, that it's very toothless to have something like that without subpoena power. That connects to the 4th item on your list, which is the law enforcement officer. I'm trying to keep the segues tight. The law enforcement officer Bill of Rights, which has within it, and I'm not an expert on it by any stretch of the imagination, you know, some restrictions that make it not possible for that body to have that type of a power over accessing records.
Got you. Okay.
So even though those bodies could be formed overnight, reforming the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights to create access to the types of data and information that's needed to be truly effective is still kind of blocked.
I get it.
By reform of that piece of code, the Bill of Rights, LEABOR as we call it. And so that was kind of my chosen baby out of our package, the Justice for All package that the Delaware Legislative Black Caucus put forward. The 2020 Justice for All package, so I don't know if we're going to have one every year. I hope so, kind of. Update it, extend it.
Right.
That would be my wish. But yeah, so that particular bill that we had for LEABOR, it wasn't the full reform or the abolition of LEABOR. We were really literally just looking to tweak a teeny tiny piece with the bill that I drafted, which created access to records for criminal defense attorneys
Okay.
or criminal defendants. And so, which doesn't currently exist. Seems like a really small thing.
Mm-hmm.
Became quickly very evident that there is a lot of stakeholder engagement required based on concerns from law enforcement and how that might endanger their ability to do their jobs. So anyway, that also becomes sort of stuck together with the civilian review boards as something on the docket for a law enforcement accountability task force. So we were able to, to get the chokehold ban and put the camera bill that we have sort of backburnered to be one of the immediate things to address next year, and then establish that law enforcement accountability task force. And I hope our discussion of the juvenile photos, which I know came up a lot with Lieutenant Dan, that the one agency that did it was, is not doing that for this time. I still think we need a bill because you get a different person at the top and you get a different result. But so we were able to influence outcomes on more than half of our 2020 Justice for All agenda, which was a very reasonable agenda. But we know our context, we know what is. I think everything we put on that list were things where we were like, we have a month left of session. What can we do?
Right.
Equal rights amendment, chokehold ban. These were not. This is the dream forever. We have a month during COVID conditions, virtual session. What could we do? I would have loved for us to do every single one of those things. But I think when you're setting your priorities, you try to find a balance between ambition and reason, right?
Sure.
As a legislator, is a negotiation that occurs. And I wouldn't say I was always satisfied. I don't know that I would say I'm satisfied now, but I was definitely had more angst about how much progress we were able to make within that agenda. But in retrospect, comparing it to what I've seen even in just a short year of being a legislator, because we had such a groundswell of advocacy, we were able to do more things, even though they seem like very basic things. These are things that wouldn't have otherwise happened, that happened and happened quickly, and I think that we should give ourselves some sense of comfort over that while pushing harder to move forward. But I do think...
I love it.
But you know what I mean? It's like...
Yes.
And I know that is not what, a strong activist would ever want to hear, nor do I ask them to accept that as an end game. But I think it shows in our current system, perhaps, the disproportionate amount of activism required to make small changes.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that is okay. I mean, it's not okay. It doesn't feel okay.
Well, I'm noticing...
But it is what it is.
I'm noticing a couple of things
Yeah.
That are consistent even with just this conversation and the conversation I had with Seligman, which in terms of education and police reform, which are two different things, but it's like, it really shows the importance of the grassroots efforts, number one.
Yeah.
And it also shows kind of the importance of just that, of everyone just mixing it up, you know what I mean? Like if you want to change these school districts, like people have to participate actively, in the school district. Like you've got to be the person who is creating harvest, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And Seligman was saying, like, all policy aside, like you've got to have officers talking to the community and not sitting in their cars. You've got to mix it up with people and really want to be that change. And that's, that's that imagined John Lennon part of me coming out, but it really is that simple.
And I think it's also, understanding what truly great and effective advocacy is. It is stepping it up to that level of participation, whether it's investing of yourself in that system, and that, like you said, that is like law enforcement officers investing themselves in the community. It's community members investing themselves in their local public schools. But I also, I've had a lot of conversations with advocates because I've been doing this for a year now, and I've seen what, an advocate lobbyist does that cuts through the system like a hot knife through butter, and also what is just slamming into a brick wall. And I've told folks, and I think sometimes when we're coming from less resourced communities, we haven't been given these tools, but you can go to the decision makers and say, fix this problem, how dare you not fix this problem. Well, like we talked about before, we're not experts in fixing all problems. We can do it, but it's like okay, I'm going to need you to help me understand what is the thing that I can do? And sometimes that's not the end game policy. Sometimes that's the interim step, that smaller policy. But we need a roadmap oftentimes. Like, don't assume we know where we're going.
Yeah.
And if you tell someone who doesn't have the worldview and the expertise in solving that problem to just solve it, when they solve it, you might not like it. So again, it requires a level of engagement with designing the solution beyond just saying fix it. You got to offer some details.
Yeah, and I think that however way you slice it, people don't understand how government works.
Well, that's exactly it. Like, how are you going to offer detailed solutions if you don't understand the system?
It's weird because people will be like,
This is why I think social studies teachers are the most important people in the world.
and it's the class that I paid attention to least.
Oh,
and that most
clearly.
people
No,
and that most people pay attention to least because they really
man.
don't see the value of it, because they don't understand the value of it, and it's not particularly interesting until you realize.
So interesting.
I agree now, but for someone who's 17, they're not necessarily thinking about changing the world right now, and they're not concerned about changing
Well,
anything.
I think because we make it oftentimes
Because you can do a lot in a little.
A history lesson, a very rote history lesson, or just like really bland civics. I teach on the university level now. I teach young undergrads at the Associates in Arts program, and I teach policy. So I've always wanted to be a social studies teacher. This is my way of leaning into my destiny, right? And I'm always amazed by these super savvy, super bright kids who seem to have an incredible grasp of national and global politics and social issues. No clue what local and state stuff, how that works. And that stuff is impacting their lives
More so
every
than
single
anything.
day. And I think it comes back to how and if that is being taught in the schools that they attend. The if first, and
I
the
think
how
it's taught
secondarily.
just as like this, but no one really explains the
It's
value
so
of
exciting,
that.
though. You don't even need to necessarily lecture on it. You can literally have a demonstration of civic participation
Right.
built into your school life.
Yeah.
And so it can be very experiential and very participatory. I was talking with a great set of faculty at Goldie Beacom recently, and we were talking about that. How do we help students sort of become, better
Politically
citizens?
engaged.
It's like if you create systems in the spaces that they have to be in, because that's where they're learning, you start to kind of cut those teeth and build those muscles, and then it's natural. But I don't think we value our schools as civic spaces. And that has to do with, are they microcosms of our society that are meant to socialize people as citizens as much as they are meant to educate you, train you to be a worker, which is, great. But I think that kind of comes back to some fundamental divides that people have around education, where it's like, is this an economic tool for me to maintain my position in the world and or advance it, or is this about becoming part of a collective society that works? And I definitely was raised with the latter philosophy, that schools are an engine of democracy. They're an engine of a healthy civil society, and they should be designed as such, which means bringing people into contact in a way that they can engage and build relationships. And those kinds of things is critical if you want to have a society that works, and understanding that the health of every single one of those school spaces has an impact on your life. I remember having that conversation with a mom, of a daughter, my daughter's age, and her making a comment, sort of, I don't know if I would say well-meaning, but an honest comment that she made in talking about choosing an elementary school. And she was like, she's like, those kids at Warner, those kids are screwed. And my feeling as a young idealistic, mom who was working in a social, justice documentary agency was, if those kids are screwed, how are our kids not screwed? Just because you're not in the same building together as 6-year-olds, if someone is getting screwed, I'm worried about what happens when they're both adults together in society who don't know each other, and one of them has been given nothing and one of them has been given everything. I'm like, my daughter can then grow up through a very cosseted system, be protected
Great
in every
word,
way.
by the way. Yes, keep going.
And, be a neuroscientist in a society that's on fire. What good is it to her to be a Nobel Prize winner in a world that's burning? because we didn't
Absolutely.
take care of this kid. And that is, so for me, that's selfish. To
Yep.
take care of that kid
I think
is
there's
completely
nothing.
self-serving.
I think that one of the, and I've been biting my tongue on ranting about this because it's not the time, but I think that one of the fundamental American problems right now is just fundamental selfishness.
Yeah.
I think that's.
But I
you know,
try to always bend the selfishness. I mean,
And I'm not above it.
well, no,
Like,
well,
yeah.
none of us are, and so I do genuinely care about this theoretical kid we're talking about.
Like,
or
we're a
set of
fucking
kids.
mess, but go ahead. Right.
And so I say it's selfish. I mean, I really do believe we have a moral obligation, just a human obligation to take care of everyone. But I do try to think about it as a lawmaker, and then when I was doing work as a graduate student, how do I sell that to people who don't feel a moral or just
Yeah.
a human obligation to that person? Think of it selfishly. Do you want to be so afraid that a kid from that school who grew up with no resources is going to break into your house, that you are miserable because you're afraid that you're going to be attacked all the time? And I don't think that that's an acceptable, think about it in those terms, or think about it in the terms of when we talk about the school education landscape. I was having a conversation with some national experts on how we fund our school districts. And the point that they were making when I asked them a question about concentrated poverty, and we talked about all the resources that are needed in a school with concentrated poverty. What does that cost to make that school as stable as this school that has no poverty? Costs a lot, by the way. I don't even think we know how much it really costs, nor can we probably afford it. So I was like, well, looking at this from an efficiency perspective, that is a cynical way that we as legislators who hold the purse strings have to make decisions. How much does it cost to operate a healthy school system? And the person said, she's like, yes, there's a fundamental accepted truth in education funding circles that the more schools of concentrated poverty that you operate, the more expensive of a school system you're operating.
Sure.
So we complain about the average cost of what we're spending on kids. We are
But that makes sense to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we look at averages statewide and say we're spending whatever we're spending, $15,000 per kid. I don't think it's that much, but something like that. That doesn't drill down to the school level needs of individual children
Right.
and what it costs, because some kids cost $50,000 to educate.
Sure.
Because maybe they have a severe disability.
Yep.
Or something like that, and some kids cost less. Essentially, the accepted truth is that the cost to provide the adequate resources to properly educate a low-income child increases the higher the concentration of poverty of the school
Yes.
that they're in.
Yeah.
Because you're creating more challenges, more flames
Yes.
for moths to be drawn to.
Yes.
And things like that. And so,
You just called me a moth.
yes, you were the
Yeah. I know.
moth part of the plane.
Right.
But we want it.
I consider myself to be a butterfly, but you wouldn't call me a moth. No. Go ahead.
in the system that we're building, everyone's a
Oh,
butterfly.
all right, okay, go ahead.
But yeah, so it's like, so basically it comes back down to that. It's like, so why are we creating and maintaining school compositions that we know are costing more money? We're not currently investing the money to make them work as well as they can. That's obvious to everyone. But even if we did, to put the money in that would help those school buildings to fully function, we have currently got an arrangement that makes our school system a lot more expensive to operate
Yep.
than we really should. So I think when I'm making a case for like socioeconomic integration, I feel like it makes more sense it should make more sense to other people that like we're talking about creating a public system that is more efficient and affordable. And even if you don't care about anyone else but your own kid and you just care about your tax bill, that should matter to you. And it should, and so which matters more to you? Does your, sort of complicity in systemic racism matter more to you than an efficient, affordable system? If it does, let's be honest about it.
But I don't
Because
even
you're
think...
paying for it. You are literally paying for it. So if you are willing to make a different choice or accept a different system to pay less, that would be amazing. If you're not, I'm not making that choice. Don't blame me.
Fair enough. So, okay.
I don't know if that was clear at all, but
It was very clear. What I want to make sure that we get to is how you got to where you are.
oh gosh.
Because you're
Where
a public
am
school
I?
kid. AI, you're Senator Tizzy Lockman. So you went to school for, what you said, film?
Film and linguistics.
Film and linguistics.
Yes.
So walk me just from, no. Let me make sure we're running. Hold on, keep going.
Gotta keep it rolling.
We are definitely rolling.
Okay.
So you went to college for film and linguistics.
Yes.
Why? Why was that your choice?
Oh my gosh.
If
Well,
you can recall.
if I can recall, I mean, as I mentioned before, I was a nerd. So I was a good student in my public schools. And I don't, why did I choose that? I did my little gap year, my reflection. I went to New York University. I was just really into movies. I was a geek, right?
Like, what are some good movies? Like, what are just some, like, you know?
Oh gosh. I mean,
what are movies that made you want to go into movies?
I was a teenager in the 90s, right? In the late 90s.
So what were some films that, like,
that was like the era of independent cinema, right? So that was like the like Tarantino, Robert Rodriguez era.
And those are the things that pulled you in.
Probably, yeah.
Yeah,
I watched a lot of violent movies as a teen, I'm realizing. But also a lot of like musicals, all these quirky Australian movies about like the LGBT community, whatever. I was just
So you really dug deep.
Oh, I was into the indie film thing. I was like, you know, I thought it was cool. I wasn't.
And was the goal for you to make films? Like,
yeah, I think I wanted to be like a movie director maybe, or probably just hang out with actors. I don't know what it really was about. I was a teenager.
Yeah, with the most vapid people. No.
Sorry, actors.
Well, entertainers
we love you.
anyway, but yeah.
But no, I mean, I don't know what I was thinking. Teenagers to me are clinically insane in many ways, and I definitely was. But so I was really drawn to that space, I think, you know, to the storytelling, and I really liked that sort of edgier. I was really drawn to subcultures.
Horror movies, you know, like not horror, but violent. You said like a lot like the Tarantino.
Like, yeah, I was kind of into it, but I liked that sort of subculture, like looking at this like non-mainstream. I grew up, you know, sort of mixed kid, feeling like a constant subculture of one. Although we did have others.
So you felt like that was kind of your space.
I was just interested in other people who were not mainstream identifying,
sure,
or with any particular group fully identifying. I mean, boy, we could do a whole other show on identity and racial identity and all the complications of that. But just was interested in feeling like a misfit, I guess. So I literally wrote my whole college essay about subcultures and that sort of affinity. But anyway, so I was interested in that. I wanted to go to film school. My dad was definitely not a fan of the idea. He literally,
as a writer.
Yeah.
Why not?
Like, he was like, don't go to school for a profession, was his philosophy on life. He's like, you could go to school to learn like content, like study an academic discipline. Not something where the tools are going to change. The tools of your trade are going to change.
Like,
over
what would
time.
He want you to do?
Like, he would have said, like, he didn't go to journalism school. He learned how to be a very successful journalist on the streets, being a journalist, just working at it. And I think his feeling was that, like, there's things that you learn through experience of work that you're better off, like, building your core content knowledge. So because as a writer, I think his thing was, why go learn the mechanics of journalism if you then have nothing to say? But that was his philosophy. I'm not necessarily promoting that to anyone, but that was his thing. So he was like, don't go learn how to like operate a camera, you know, go learn stuff. So I I started out in the College of Arts and Sciences, where we did all the basic, you know, sort of Western civ stuff. And then transferred in my sophomore year to this school of individualized study at NYU called the Gallatin School. And literally it was like, make up your own major, come up with your own sort of concept of what you want to do, and really focused on experiential learning.
Sort of like what your dad was.
Basically, except it cost a lot more per year, and I'm still paying for it. But we can talk about student loans in another episode, too. Yes. Anyway. But, so I sort of brought the film studies in. I wanted to take some classes out of the film school. And then I was just always fascinated by language. I spent my senior year of high school in Italy, because I just wanted to go do something different and get away.
What part?
Northern Italy, so I was like Padua, which is halfway between Verona and Venice.
Okay.
And so I studied Latin in high school at AI. I lived in Italy for a year, and I was just fascinated by sort of the acquisition of language that happens when you're doing that kind of thing. And so I was just fascinated by like the science of language. So I just decided to start taking classes in that. And then, layered that with a lot of like sociology, anthropology types of courses, just sort of about life.
Did the major that you created for yourself did you name it?
We called them concentrations.
Okay.
So I studied with a concentration in film and linguistics. I'm sure this is fascinating.
It actually is, but go ahead.
But no, and I loved linguistics. There's actually a lot of linguists who are political thinkers, not least of which is Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky, if folks are progressive, or probably more accurately leftists, you know who he is, and you've probably read him. His profession is a linguistics professor. He was a linguistics professor at MIT for, I don't know if he still is. He's probably retired at this point. But so there's something about that, the way language is used, the way language is structured across different cultures that is meaningful. It was just fascinating to me. I still sometimes have regrets that I didn't become a full-on linguist, academic, because it just is, I could talk for hours about
it makes sense that
fascinating it is.
linguistics would have an impact on
Politics.
because you say a lot of things and you need to convince people.
Well, not only, yes, that, and also I think,
and if you can say it in a way that relates and that is convincing, that's valuable for what it's a sword.
And something that we hear a lot about, some of the debates that we're having, think about the term, defund the police, and how that, some people are like, yes, this is my rallying cry, and other people are like, oh, terrified. And words have an incredible amount of power.
If you said defund, and if you said something instead of defund, it could have a totally different
or
impact.
even the way people use the word racism, and they're coming at something. So basically, think of the word defund, think of the word racism. When people clash on this, as we get to see every day on Facebook, they are literally coming to the table with completely different definitions of those words.
Right.
And so in a sense, we are having debates where people are speaking different languages. It's like one person speaking Greek, one person speaking Japanese. That is an incredible dynamic.
Black Lives Matter is the perfect example of that. It's bro, that's not what I'm saying.
So politics is linguistics. It's this fascinating study of the way we communicate to one another. Even when we're speaking the same language, we're not speaking the same language. And I'm just interested in that conceptually, but I'm also probably even more so. I don't know if
I think that's a beautiful quote, actually. Even when we're not though we're not speaking the same language,
we're not
speaking the same language, right?
And it's how do you understand that dynamic? Because it's interesting, but then how do you fix that? How do you start to bridge that together and get people, which is really hard to do, by the way, if you're not attending the same types of schools that are teaching similar types of things or in the same spaces, which is also comes back to comprehensive schools as ways to build civil society. Separate-ish thing. But I just think it's fascinating. And
dude, my best friend voted for Trump and has a problem with Black Lives Matter. And I don't even waste my time. I can't. I don't have the. I don't.
But how does he reconcile that with his value for you as a human being?
Because it's personal. It's very individual, and it's he's been such an incredible individual, personal. No, you're right.
Looking at him, not you.
No, either way, I literally at this point just avoid it, because at the end of the day, our relationship is based upon our individual interactions, and he's been the most generous person to me as a friend that you could absurdly, generous.
Oh yeah.
And it's he just doesn't get it, and he's not going to get it. And,
but he's literally coming. He's been raised with a different language. This is something that we learn in linguistics when you're looking at foreign languages. It's there are words that don't exist in other languages, and that is both a product of the culture in which they exist. Everyone hears the whole thing of Eskimos have 100 words for snow. I don't know. I think that's wrong, but that type of a thing.
Yep.
They have 100 words for snow because it's relevant to their culture. It both comes from and perpetuates their culture, and so I mean that's kind of the thing. It's language doesn't just come from where you're coming from. It builds you in that direction and keeps you in that direction. And so that's why the need for common language is so important. And that the more that we kind of narrow cast ourselves into separate spaces, the less stability, and to me, the less peace and safety is possible.
Yep.
And that's exactly what we've been doing for the last, I think since the 80s. But anyway, we could have a whole other show about how I believe that 1985 was the peak of American civilization. But
whoa, that's a thought. 85.
Music, policy.
Is that Michael Jackson? He was popping in 85.
The early 80s were amazing. I mean, I was born in '79, so the end of '79. So I
didn't realize I was that much older than you. Ha!
Are you?
76.
Are you? Oh, you're like my sister. I didn't realize that either. I actually think you're younger than me most of the time.
Yes, that's right. I get it from my mom. No.
But no, the music, even just things of I don't know. I just grew up with that thing of looking at We Are the World. And again, I know I'm a kumbaya integrationist. I'm not going to apologize for that. But I remember looking at the We Are the World, and you've got like country, and I don't know if there were any people from the hip hop or rap space involved in that, but if you've got pop and country, you had different races and R&B.
Think so. Not at that point. Yeah.
No, probably not. But you definitely had more like the R&B or soul singers.
For sure.
Everyone in the same room, and you had this sense that like they were peers and part of the same community, and so could we be? You know, I don't know.
Plus the genius of
Very
Quincy Jones being able to
idealistic.
wrangle all those people like a politician.
It was just a model of this. To me, this is like a utopian vision of society that we like had,
Okay.
and then got kind of pulled apart. I've had conversations about this with people who are in other spaces like maternal health, and looking at data of how gaps were closing through, you know, the 70s and early 80s based on some policy decisions that we made to better integrate schools, to empower communities sort of on the heels of Black Power movement and things like that, where people were accessing health care, yada, 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 or even just had a sense of political efficacy and their civil rights, and how we saw improvements in things like maternal health. So the closure of gaps between bad outcomes for white mothers and black mothers were shrinking, and then around the 1985 point, we started seeing all those gaps that we were closing start to widen again. Academic outcomes, health outcomes, because we began to, in my opinion, over-individualize the sort of the basic fundamentals of what our policies were driving people to do and to make choices about. And so it's over-individualizing it. So I don't, like I said, I don't blame individuals for making the choices that they make, but I think that the government bears a responsibility for creating a context that makes that a healthy
Makes me
proposition.
make decisions like the ones that I make, right?
Or it makes it hard. It shouldn't be harder for someone to make a decision that benefits their community. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a great
And that
point.
is what I think that we do. Because every parent that I know who was like, I want to send my child to a school that's diverse, or I want to send them to the neighborhood school, but it feels like that is going to be such a burden. And it's not always wrong. There's truth in that assumption. Not total truth.
Nope.
And the more of us that make that choice, the easier it gets.
Absolutely.
Again, back to participation. But,
No, you're right.
But if we create a system that makes it harder, whose fault is that? That's the people who are designing those systems. But then again, that does come back to those of us who are doing the voting and the electing and the pushing of elected officials and the holding accountable and all that stuff to make sure that the right decisions are being made.
So hold on. So back to Chomsky, and you're in
Oh,
school.
Chomsky! Oh, I forgot about
You're in
that.
school, and you're so you finish school, and then
Back
what's
to
the next
Chomsky.
step?
Actually.
Yeah.
So when I was in college, 9/11 happened, and I
You want to hear some snotty shit?
Yeah.
You know where I was when
Were you,
9/11
like, in
happened?
France?
I was in Vienna.
Oh, were you?
I was in Vienna,
I did
Austria.
A year, weird, like, it's like, let's have a,
Oh my God.
rename the show, Bougie Time.
Right.
I had just gotten back from France.
The Boulay times here. Here we go.
I did my semester in France the semester before 9/11.
Okay.
So I had just moved back
Right.
to NYU that September, like literally the week before 9/11.
Oh, wow.
Into an apartment
Wow.
in Lower Manhattan, 5 blocks away
Wow.
from the towers. So I was in my apartment on the 18th floor on, I forget the name of the street, but anyway, a few blocks away when it happened, blah, blah, blah.
Wow.
So I probably lost a little time to everything that occurred in that era, because I had never
Do you
suffered
think that-
PTSD or anything, depression or anything like that really in my life. I'm a pretty even-keeled person. And it definitely, as it shook us all to our core, really affected me in ways I didn't even know until
Do
years
you
later.
think that played into your sense of community building because you felt such a sense of community at that time? I'm just throwing stuff out there.
That's a great question. I don't know. I mean, I think I had a lot of roots of thinking communally that
Either
came
way.
from growing up with great public school educators who were like strong union leaders and thinking about all the needs of all the kids, all this kind of stuff. And then my dad's perspective, my mom's perspective, my experience, to be honest, going to high school in Europe for a year definitely impacted me. But I mean, it definitely probably changed my priorities in some way. I don't know. It was a hard time. Not directly, I don't think. I mean, I think probably that stuff maybe came more from the work I did afterwards. But
9/11.
9/11 happened. I definitely got a little off track. I actually I think I flunked my last semester of college. I think I stopped going to class. I was like, I'm going to just work now.
Wow.
Because I had a couple good jobs. And I had been doing a lot of working in media at the time through college. So Nickelodeon, Lionsgate, and some other things. I was just like interning and blah, blah, blah. So I was like, I'm just going to focus on work and not really worry about my classes. So I failed out of college, sort of.
Wow.
I didn't fail out, but I just didn't finish.
I got you.
I didn't finish. So I took a long break in which many things happened in my life. My father had Lou Gehrig's disease and passed away. And I had my daughter.
Right.
And then after those huge upheavals of birth and death in my life, I did go back one summer when my daughter was 2 and just finished my bachelor's. So then I'm done college.
Then you moved back to Delaware?
I moved back to Delaware to have my daughter.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
So I was back with her, and then I went back to New York to finish my degree.
Wow.
And then I was just here. I was working for the production company.
Right.
I was doing Public Allies, and that really gave me a strong sense, I think, of community development and my personal empowerment to do it. So that, quite frankly, when it came time to put my daughter in school and think about, why couldn't I run this PTA? That I think I had the tools and the mindset to be thinking not just about my ability to lead something, but also the importance of leading for all and not just for myself. I'm a huge fan of Public Allies and AmeriCorps in general. As a way, honestly, I think everyone should do national service. Yeah. And if they choose to do military service,
I totally
right
agree.
on.
I'm actually surprised to hear you say that, but I totally agree.
It's kind of a little bit of a lefty thing to do. I think which is just like everyone needs to learn. Just sort of some of those key elements of functional society, and I think a lot of people might choose the military, but we have so many other things we could do in the national service space. I mean, I was literally running youth camps, and that was my national service. And there's lots of other things you can do. I know in Europe, I knew people who were volunteer firefighters. That was their national
I love
service,
that.
So I think there are non-military ways to serve your country and learn about your country and maybe learn about communities that are different from you. That national service can provide. And then of course you get paid and you get benefits to finish your college. I was able to use that stipend to finish college actually, because I did Public Allies before I finished college. So yeah, that was a tumultuous time in my life.
Yeah, but within a couple years after
post 9/11,
right,
it was a real shakeup.
That's crazy.
But yeah, and so then I think once I enrolled my daughter in school and started being really interested both in what was going on with these kids I was working with and what was going on with my daughter in her school, I just became obsessed with understanding the why. Why does one school look like Shangri-La in the public system and one school look like hell? Not the one my daughter was in, but I knew they existed. And how do we fix it? And so I started becoming obsessed with that idea because again, the idea to me is that if any child is screwed anywhere, my child is screwed, and that's not acceptable. And it kind of went from there. So I mean, I had the opportunity in part because of the Public Allies link to enroll in graduate school and work for the university while I did it so I could get tuition remission. And so I left my day job as a producer and administrator at the production company, and I went full into a couple of years of working on my master's, and that was amazing. I had a great experience. I was at the Biden, now it's called the Biden School at UD, and I was able to put my focus on researching the things that I wanted to research. I literally wrote my thesis about, it was the 20th anniversary of charter and choice policy. Okay. So I wrote a very long thesis, which is on my LinkedIn if someone wants to read really embarrassing pseudo-academic writing from me, pretty painful. I was just trying to think through what was the history that led us there. I listened to all the floor debates that had occurred in that policy being developed, and I was basically talking about, what had sort of been promised when this policy was done, and now looking back 20 years later, how much has that been realized or not, which I think is maybe something we could stand to do more often, is revisit our policies and reform them. And so I came to the conclusion that I actually used risk as sort of the design measure. Probably pretty awkward if you're reading it. You're happy to take feedback, but I was looking at it in terms of what is the risk level in the schools, and do we have more high-risk schools now than we used to, meaning more schools of higher poverty, poor outcomes than we did back when back before that policy was implemented. And so it seemed to me, it was pretty clear that we have more schools of concentrated poverty, which are higher risk places to enroll your child.
Right.
And, you know, what could we do to infuse equity into that policy system of choice and charter and things like that. So that was just what I was interested in. Grad school gave me the opportunity to work on that. Tony Allen, who I knew he knew my dad. We knew each other sort of through Public Allies because he was the founder of that program here in Delaware.
Wow, I had no idea.
And
that's awesome. That's incredible.
Yeah. And so he was tapped to start the Wilmington Education Improvement Commission.
Wow.
Or really the Wilmington Education Advisory Committee.
Is he from Delaware?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, actually, no. He was born somewhere else. You have to ask him. Bring him on.
Yeah, I know.
I'm sure he'd be happy
to
tell you lots of stories. But so he was tapped to lead that, and then he brought a bunch of us, you know, sort of people who weren't normally the ones on all those committees he wanted to bring together to talk about what do we do about Wilmington schools, because there'd been a bunch of crappy things happening at the time, including to my daughter's school. So there was some federal policy and state action on it targeted my daughter's school. Anyway, that happened. A couple of charters that were quite beloved by the community but were poorly performing were being shuttered. Your dad was very involved in those conversations. And so there was just like this perfect storm of stuff happening. So this group was formed. I was asked to join it. We formed another body to advance policies on the basis of that, and I was asked to be the vice chair. And that kind of snowballing really went from there. And to be honest, being the vice chair of WIAC was probably the closest contact I had ever had with Dover and the way policy making happened in Dover. And I will say that it was like an abject failure of an experience because we did not really get beyond where we wanted to with it, but it really taught me about what some of those barriers are to advancing policy. And for some reason, that made me think maybe I should go be one of the I should go be part of the problem. No, I'm not. I don't believe that. I think Dover is obviously an important place to be. I don't think it's people wanting to be part of the problem. I think, like we talked about, there's processes and differing ideologies and ideas that make it not always the easiest place to navigate. But I think that's, you know, I just wanted to be a part of that and do what I could to make it work more in the interest of the community that we live in. So yeah, that's kind of what happened. And in that interim, kind of sneaking that in there, I had the amazing opportunity to go work for Ray Jones Avery at the Christina Cultural Arts Center, and kind of marry my interest of having worked in sort of the arts administration space and do some organizing in the education space at once in the same building.
That's pretty perfect.
And it was so lucky. And so I was the director of that program, of a program which it's still hanging on. Hopefully it'll get back on its feet again. But PACE, the Parent Advocacy Council for Education. And the goal of that is really to empower people in our underserved communities to understand the systems that underserve them and learn how to participate in them so that those systems can become more reflective of and better serve them. And I'm just a huge believer in that. I think you cannot necessarily serve people in a theoretical sense. Folks have to be at the table, and in order for them to be at the table and be really heard at the table, it's this two-way street. So we need people in seats of power who are receptive to where they're coming from, but we also need people who are direct representatives of those communities to be schooled in the ways the systems work and even how to navigate. I'm not promoting tone policing, but we do need to sometimes help folks figure out, like, who do I talk to, how do I talk to them to maximize getting what I need.
I'm not trying to plug my boy here, but everything you're saying is exactly what Jahidi's been saying.
Oh, yeah. I didn't listen to that episode yet.
No, I didn't. I have no expectations. But I'm just saying, like, that's a lot of what he's saying. Is like, you know, he really sees the value in the civic associations and all those kinds of things. And
my gosh, yes.
Yeah, and I'm starting to see it more, even in my own little neighborhood.
We have to strengthen those structures of power.
It makes a difference. I'm getting it more and more.
Well, it makes our job easier as legislators. Like, yes, I am a black woman, but I come from the upbringing I came from. I come from the neighborhood I come from. I have a very receptive stance to you know, through friendships and work that I've done and all these kinds of things to understand communities that some of my colleagues don't have access to. But I still always felt, even as the leader of PACE, I'm like, my goal is to have someone more authentically connected to an underserved background lead this. You know, I set up an advisory group that I felt was reflective of that, because I didn't, you know, when you are a brown person who is easy to talk to, you get asked to do a lot of things on behalf
Including
of
being
other
a
people.
spokesman for everyone, right?
And I think that is, you know, I think that is a little bit of a violation of authenticity sometimes. And I think you have a responsibility to be a bridge, but not to accept yourself as the ultimate spokesperson for a community that you have not lived in.
Dude, I think one of the
Or an
things that
experience
never
you haven't lived, right? Yeah.
Well, one of the things that that doesn't get stated almost at all is the amount of diversity within the black community. And I don't mean in terms of color. I mean in terms of just philosophy. There's a huge spectrum of different politics, and how we think we should do that. You know, and we don't give ourselves enough credit for the diversity of thought that's in there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
No, people love to sort of put the black community as a monolith.
Yeah, that's the black vote. Nah.
Right, and I think, and I've said this to many of my progressive friends, and I consider myself a progressive, so I don't think it's news for me to say this now, but I've said, I'm like, I think that is a key point of reflection, which I think I learned through the growth of doing my PACE work, because I had to learn. I had to learn as a PTA president and then as PACE director that, you know, I, young progressive from a middle class background, think I have all the answers.
You don't.
The answer's for black people, you know?
Right.
And when I actually talk to someone, you know, in Hilltop or something, and say, yeah, choice is really problematic, they're like, not for me. And so I think we have to listen. We have to listen to people, and we have to really be careful. I think especially as progressives who really want a stronger communal, collective, you know, civil society, that when we're speaking for the vulnerable, that we make sure that we're really listening to the vulnerable and what they want.
Yep.
And not disregard them when they might push back on what we think the solutions are.
Seems like a lot of your role really is to listen.
Yeah, I love it.
Right? You really perked up and meant that shit. That's great. That's fantastic.
I do. I actually
That's
have
good.
a keychain with an ear on it, in part to
Wow.
remind myself.
Let me
You
see.
see it?
Let the people see the ear.
People usually look at me like I'm nuts when I show them this, but I'm proud of it.
No, I think it's fantastic.
Because I can talk a lot,
Wow.
obviously. But when I was running my campaign, I got this for myself, and I was like, you have to remember, just because you're educated and you went and you studied this policy or that policy, and you just want to yammer on about what you think the solutions are, it is probably even more important to listen to.
For sure.
Certainly your constituents. And
Knowing
I
that
think
you're
that's
never the
another-
expert, almost never, you know what I
I
mean?
don't think, I mean, I have a strong sense of never being the expert, but I'm very aware of my role in, you know, cultivating expertise and prioritizing based on what I'm hearing from the people that I represent. But I absolutely have my own opinions on the world and policies and all these things, but I did not sign up to be necessarily an ideologue about it. And I know not everyone appreciates the not being an ideologue on issues, but I'm very aware that I represent people with a variety of worldviews and experiences, and it's important to me to figure out how best to represent that rather than just go and be myself right all the time, or in your own mind right all the time on what you want to do, and speak for that, or sort of speak for your ideological peers. There's a place for that, and there's a place to push hard for that when it is right and urgent, and so I don't disavow that at all, and that feels like everything right now. But I also think it's really important, especially as a state legislator doing local work, that you really have an opportunity to directly interface with your constituents, understand them, and meet them where they are, and represent that in our legislature. So,
What are your like immediate goals right now? Like, what are the things that are on the chop? Like, I really want to get this done within the next year, 2 years.
well, I mean, my priority going down was advancing what was sort of seated with WEIC, and so we transformed that. Nnamdi and I reauthorized that body as the Reading Consortium for Educational Equity. And so we have been COVIDed, as we say in Dover, a lot. We got really stalled on our progress. And I want us to fully realize what that body can do in advancing policies that speak towards equity. And then I would even say lean a little bit more further and a little bit further and more explicitly into the anti-racism aspect of what that means. Because it's one of those words matter, that people don't say because they don't want to offend anyone, but I think that equity is anti-racism, maybe exactly, but definitely at least partially.
Right.
And so I really want us to fully realize the potential of that body to do the work of reforming our educational system so that we create a space that people can enroll their children in if they have doubts, but really more importantly, that we create a system that just with what things currently are, that we're better resourcing where resources are needed, making sure that the educators have what they need, that our students have diverse, well-equipped educators, and all that good stuff. So that is definitely a priority. I'm still very committed, on the criminal justice front, particularly on this law enforcement reform front. I'm not necessarily the leader on that stuff, but
like now is the time with that stuff. Like
exactly.
I know that we have.
Well, and that's the thing. Your priorities shift based on what's possible, and what's possible sometimes shifts based on what the public is calling for.
Sure.
And so, at the beginning of this session, I don't know that any of the Justice for All stuff would have been on our agenda.
Hell no.
But you take the opportunity that's provided to you by public organizing to act. So that could change. But the education piece is just sort of something I inherently brought to the table that I can continue to work on.
Yeah.
Before we go back into session, I'm doing some cool things. We're building new committees. So we have the African American Task Force that is being developed by the Black Caucus. And I decided to get away from the education piece, and I asked to chair the subcommittee that's focused on infrastructure and environment, because I'm really interested in transportation issues. I'm really interested as well. I get a lot of call from constituents around environmental justice issues, so I really want to lean into that in the next few months. And just learn. I'm going to be learning and trying to understand what types of policies can we do. How do we make sure, our transportation policy and investments match up with the needs of equity.
Yeah.
Because it all comes back to equity. For me, and always has. That's what I ran on. And and then I also have had the opportunity to chair a subcommittee with the county. So they have a bunch of CARES Act money, $350 million.
Damn.
I know.
Woo.
And so I was asked to chair a group that's looking at vulnerable populations. And it's a really short-term committee. It's like a month of work, but we are looking at what are some potential ways we can spend CARES Act money on vulnerable populations, like people experiencing homelessness, people on the behavioral health spectrum, low resource households, and other types of special populations, whether we're talking undocumented, just people of color generally, young people. How can we invest in COVID impacted areas to bolster that? So there's a lot of opportunity there. There's nothing more fun as a legislator, I don't think, than when you have the opportunity to actually, as closely as possible, allocate resources to anyone, but particularly I think to communities like those. For me, that's the stuff that I was hoping to be able to put my emphasis on. And every time you go into one of those experiences, you're always going to learn something that you're going to take to the next rodeo, because you're not always going to get everything you want the first time. But it's definitely, I'm getting a lot of opportunities to engage with policies that exist and learn more about those, and resources that exist and learn more about those, and help figure out how we can best, fit all this stuff together so that we have a public systems that work together and help people thrive more than we're doing. It's interesting work. I love it. It's sort of endless. You never know what you're going to get when you answer the phone every day as a legislator. Sometimes it's that big state level policy stuff, but sometimes it's just answering calls about prostitution or crematoriums come into town.
So you know.
I pay attention to what's going on in my community.
I know, but there's a lot. You have a lot of ground to cover. So
Yeah.
the fact that you know those things is good. You know what I mean? Yeah.
But that's our job.
But you seem to really enjoy it.
It's fun to solve problems, and you can maybe solve a problem like these more
but there's
quickly than
book
education.
problems where you're solving, math and science, and there's different kinds of problems.
Yeah.
Like I solve music problems, but
that's true.
That's me.
Thank you.
And
That's the other thing we did this year. We
What?
formed an arts caucus.
I heard about that. I did. Someone told me to watch the Zoom meeting for
That's
that. But I
okay.
was not
So that's going to really be a thing that we're focusing on in the next 6 months, and that's like a fun thing. So everything is not gloom and doom and failed systems. Sometimes it's just like, how do we celebrate what's awesome in our districts? I mean, I have downtown Wilmington, the riverfront in the district I represent. I mean, what an arts mecca. And then the big part of that is like, then how do we, again, infuse equity into that conversation by going beyond how do we support our major arts institutions who are in a really bad pinch?
Absolutely,
these
everyone
days.
is.
But before that all happened, it was sort of like, well, I have a lot of neighbors who are individual artists trying to make ends meet in a society that is not particularly welcoming to people making a living as professional artists and thinking about healthcare and all this other stuff. So I want to make sure that that's part of that conversation too. How do we make Delaware, well, really my district and Wilmington, but all of Delaware a place where someone can be an artist and not feel like they're just counting the days until they can move somewhere else that's more hospitable.
Right. Well, you know what? That is actually, I think, a place where we are exactly in alignment, because everything that I do as an artist at this point is with that in mind.
Yeah.
It's because I really fundamentally believe that this place could be a little mecca, and that's honestly how I've seen Delaware, and really more specifically Wilmington, because I just, and this is my ideal self, but like I've said over and over again, I just don't. We should be a cultural hub, and it's not there yet. But I see between the different musicians that we all know, like, the potential is so there, and I just feel like if just one or two of us get to that next level and stay, that all of a sudden, like, you know, all of a sudden if I have something that pops, and all of a sudden if I was sitting here talking to John Legend, and it's like all of a sudden now that is the switch. All of a sudden, you know, if I can get one big time artist to just do a show with me on Market Street and build it from there, and like make people realize how much potential is, and even with the Ronapalooza thing, like, you know, I'm bringing in, you know, artists from Baltimore and Philly who are like, this is going on in Delaware, and it's like if and I think that actually is where your point is kind of fundamentally made. It's like we have to build it here. And keep it here, because I ain't going nowhere at this point, and I really don't want to, because even though
but we don't, we have young artists that are leaving. We don't want them to leave either.
No, we don't. But it's like, even though it's not,
we want them to come back.
We want them to come back, and even though it's not what it should be and could be, it's like I feel it can be, and like it's just about building.
What, I mean, and what's missing? I mean, I don't know. Like, and to me, that's like, it's not just. It's a whole spectrum. There's small local things, but then sometimes it's federal issues. It's Medicare for all. It's at local issues. It's great public schools that enable someone who's not making millions a year to live happily in this community, you know. And then sometimes it's just,
you know, I always tend to err, I think, on the side of, you know, not realizing the things that are missing. But I really do feel like, as an artist, the main thing I have to do is work on myself. Like, you know, like I need to be writing songs that are, and it's not, this isn't meant to be an arrogant like thing to say, but like I need to be writing shit that's as good as anyone's. You know what I'm saying?
But so what chips away at your ability, your time, your resources?
It's my time
to
at
do
this
that?
point. For me, it's I need time to really be able to hone my craft.
So what are you spending your time on instead of honing your craft?
So a lot of my time gets spent, like, and this has been the beauty of COVID.
Don't blame your kids. Think about the
definitely the kids. Listen. Ray, you're the reason why we're not rich. No. It's your fault. No. It's and listen, I've wasted a lot of time before kids, but like at this point, COVID has been, on one hand, I've lost so much income, and thank God I've had 15 different jobs, but like now I'm able to spend a couple hours a day working on my improvisation, learning pieces of my craft that I should have learned, you know, when I was in school, really understanding and creating the like, songwriting is engineering, you know what I'm saying? And just having it to be that at my fingertips, where I'm not sitting around waiting for inspiration.
Yeah.
It's getting myself to be a master of my craft. It's a craft, you know what I'm saying? And it's being able to execute at that level.
Yeah.
And the other thing is having the ability the ability and time to, and this is funny, the overlap, to function like a politician is to get my ass out in front of everybody and just grind, so that everyone knows who the hell I am.
Yeah.
It's those two pieces for me. It's different for some people, but I think that the bottom line is for us, like, you know, as artists, we have to insist on being excellent. It's not just like, oh, that was so great, that was cute. That's no. That has to, you've got to be slaying crowds. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
We've got a couple like Darnell can do that. It's like, whoa.
To redefine kind of what excellence is.
What excellence, like, it can't just be like, you know, there's a difference between what Darnell can do and going to your average open mic thing. Like, there's just a different level of skill.
Yeah.
It's a different skill set.
Yeah.
And unless you are reaching for that absolute mastery, it's not going to get there. You know, you got to have someone come in from Philly and be like, who the hell was that? I'm coming back down for that.
Yeah.
You know, and I want that. It's just the same thing as Bardea.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, I have had friends who have called me like, have you heard of this place called Bardea? Like, yeah, that's in your town, right? It's in Wilmington. I'm like, yep. And it's because their shit is it's masterful food. It sounds snobby as hell.
Yeah.
I don't care. But that's the level everything has to be at.
Yeah.
And, you know, that is the difference.
And broadly, you need a critical mass of that.
The critical mass.
The critical mass is key, because if you just have those isolated, again, I hate to pull everything back
and
to
to
schools.
stay and to stay.
But to me, the parallels are always so evident. It's like it's great to have a couple of amazing schools, you know, in the public system that people feel we can be proud of. I think it's better to have an entire landscape and system of them. That's going to draw people. I can go there and know that my kid is going to be able to enroll in a local public school by choice or by neighborhood, and it's going to be a great place for them to learn. It's just like, I know I can go there and I can be an artist who's supported and heard, and have the time to really work on my craft and hold myself to a high standard.
Yes.
I mean, if you're chipping away at people with, you know, 1,000 little cuts of making ends meet and navigating life, you know, it is hard to meet that standard.
Yes.
And I you know, I feel the same way with our school system. Sometimes I'm like, yeah, we have a lot. I think we have bright spots in every school building. So when we talk about there being, not really a believer in bad kids or bad schools or bad, you know, whatever. But I do think we can create a system where there's more broad flourishing happening, and I think that's true in a lot of our systems. I think that's, you know, our artistic community, and how do you set a context that enables and encourages that, or that kind of maintains this sort of unsteady, you know, not excellence.
Yeah.
I don't want to use any mean words, because I think everybody's working really hard, and I think we have an incredible amount of talent. I'm talking about schools, I'm talking about artists, I'm talking about all of our spaces, but it's like,
high standards
sometimes
and
we
selflessness.
hinder ourselves, and I think we hinder ourselves sometimes by leaning on the wrong sort of fundamental philosophies about operating our public sector, operating our society. And again, you know, I hate to hammer on it, but I think sometimes we make decisions, like in the school system, that favor negative drivers like prejudice over excellence, and we've made a choice. We have this false sense of excellence because there's no brown kids there, and what that actually does is hinder us from actually really fully realizing excellence in our school system at large, because we've chosen the wrong indicator.
It's like the whole garden isn't flourishing, right? Right?
Yeah, the highest flower looks pretty nice. It could be so much higher if we sort of broke down some of these negative these negative drivers of behaviors that our policy allows. So it's like, how do we make policy call that into question and clear that away?
So what's kind of our
moral?
Our moral.
Moral of
What's the
today?
main lesson that we've learned today? You know what I'm saying? Like, what is the? It's something about building your own community, right?
Yeah.
It's right.
Well, I mean, I think it's about
Like really actively
participate.
participating.
The participation piece.
Oh my god! Did you see that? No. Oh my god!
It's the participation. It's that knowledgeable civic participation where you can understand that difference between that immediate, what can I build here in my community, and how does that interact with those levels of government in creating the context for me to be the best on my own. I think of it as like an incline sometimes. It's like, how hard is it for me to be a great artist? How hard is it for me to have my kid go to outstanding schools? Like, is it the incline this high, or is it like a nice easy walk? And I think those higher levels of policy are the ones that make it, whether it's a real hard climb or like just sort of a little ramp.
Flatten that curve too.
And our participation is necessary, you know, in helping that. Yes, flatten that curve too.
Cool. Yeah. I think we could talk for another 2 hours.
Did we talk for 2 hours?
I'm pretty sure.
Ooh, we did. Oh my gosh.
Crazy, right?
If you listen to this, you are.
No, they will. There's so much stuff. Like, yeah.
This
Thank
was
you.
fun.
That was fun, and I think I learned a whole lot.
I feel like I did not follow my ear, and I talked more than I should have listened.
Well, it's the podcast about you. You're supposed
But I'm
to be
going
the
to
one
listen
talking.
to the other episodes.
Yeah, you were
fully.
supposed to be the one talking.
Okay.
Thank
fair
you
enough.
for your time,
Thank
Senator
you for yours.
Elizabeth Tizzy Lockman.
I hope people liked it. Feel free to let me know.
I think you handled that perfectly. And I'm going to push the stop button so that you can say all the inappropriate things you said before the camera was going.